Now, hopefully the technology will work well for us this morning. So I'd like to welcome Minister Janelle Saffin.
Thank you, Mel. And look, can I say thank you for that lovely introduction. And you rightly say that I'm passionate about the Reconstruction Authority, passionate about what we're charged to do, and passionate about the launch today of the Disaster Adaptation Guidelines, because in some ways they're quite revolutionary. A document that can look ordinary, but quite a revolutionary change. And I'm truly sorry I can't be there in person, as I am in the Northern Rivers with the Minister for Emergency Management, Regional Development and Local Government, Christy McBain, and amongst other things, we're about to do some announcements about major recovery work to get underway up here. Yes, recovery work, after 3 and a bit years, because we know how long it takes to do. And after the recent severe weather events in New England, the Mayor of Gunnedah Shire said at a meeting, it was reported to me that the Mayor said there should be more money for resilience and upgrading infrastructure so we don't have to do constant repairs. And that's become our refrain now. We know that we have to do that. And why am I saying it now? It's because it highlights for me why today is so important. We have to shift the dial, as I say, on how we prepare and how we deal with disasters, and we need to invest in mitigation, in adaptation and resilience right across the state. And can I say I'm heartened to see the interest by those in the room, and it's a large amount of people. I keep hearing the little beeps as people keep joining online, so it's great to see that. And people are from all over the state and beyond. And we know this work has been eagerly awaiting, but I'm really, really proud of the time, effort and expertise that's been given to get these guidelines right. The team at RA have worked really hard, really well, and done deep engagement with communities, and particularly with local councils. So I acknowledge mayors and councillors and joint organisations there today to get them right. I feel like I've travelled with the guidelines from the conception until now, because I, as local member and as parliamentary secretary and now minister, I appreciate the value that they're bringing to disaster risk reduction. And that's what it's about. All of us pacted to implement the Sendai framework. It's about risk reduction, and that's what the disaster adaptation guidelines are very focused on. That is their core. And you'll hear more about that today. We do need to change our approach to disaster management. Some things we do well, some things we need to do better. I said when I was appointed that we need to have better preparation. That gives us a better response and better recovery. There's a lot of things we have to do in that space. And disaster adaptation planning, it aims to shift that, be more proactive in the planning. And it's not only fiscally responsible, but it reduces burdens on our communities, and it helps save lives and livelihoods. Look, if I was with you face to face where I could interact with the audience, I would want to say more. And but because I'm coming in online, I'll leave my comments at that. I just want to thank you, Mel. You're the absolutely right person to lead the Reconstruction Authority. I want to thank everyone who worked on the Disaster Adaptation Guidelines. I'll do that through you, Amanda Leck, and the team, and also the people who are working on the 2 disaster adaptation plans that are underway. You know about the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley, which is complete, and the one in the Northern Rivers that is underway. There's 5 other projects that are underway that I wouldn't call disaster adaptation planning projects, but they're projects that can lead to that and inform that. So, there's a lot of work to be done. We'll have them across every region in the state, but today is the start. The Hawkesbury Nepean Valley and the Northern Rivers didn't have these guidelines. So in some ways, what they're doing has informed the guidelines, but everyone now will have these and will be able to work together. It's a collaborative approach and working particularly with local councils and communities. So walking hand in hand, collaboration, so that we reduce risk and we make sure our communities are safer and stronger. So with those few comments, I'm very happy to have the honour to launch the Disaster Adaptation Planning Guidelines. Thank you, Mel, and thank you everyone who's there.
Well, thank you, Minister Saffin. I think it's pretty easy to hear the passion in her voice and her commitment to actually reducing risk in the community. Apologies if my back is to you, Minister. I'm sure you can see me from the front. It feels strange standing with my back to you. The Minister and I worked very closely together when I was the recovery coordinator in the Northern Rivers following the terrible 2022 floods. And having visited these communities more recently in my role with the RA, I've seen the long tail of recovery, which is exacerbated and compounded by successive events, but really highlights the reason why we need to focus on risk reduction, adaptation and mitigation to reduce the impacts on communities. As Minister Saffin shared, the New South Wales Reconstruction Authority was established to lead our state's efforts to reduce disaster risk and build long-term resilience. Our mission is clear: to help communities prepare for, withstand and recover from natural hazards. While we can't stop nature, where we can mitigate its impacts and adapt to its challenges is where the biggest benefits can be achieved for communities now and into the future. We are addressing gaps in programs and policies and setting out a clear roadmap of short and medium-term actions for disaster risk reduction. These structural changes are what makes DAPS possible. They help clarify clear roles and responsibilities, allocate resources efficiently, and promote community inclusion and participation, which is essential. They align with global frameworks, as the Minister pointed out, ensuring we're building resilience in a way that's integrated and sustainable and learning from the best in the world facing a global challenge. We do this by working across government, industry, and communities to reduce exposure, vulnerability, and ultimately the costs of disasters before they happen. In my relatively short time leading the RA, we've been called upon to support communities dealing with the preparation and aftermath of tropical cyclones, floods, major storms, and coastal erosions. As I look around the room, many of you in local government, in industry, and certainly right across government, we've had numerous contacts recently. I'd like to say those contacts haven't been because of disaster, but they really do sharpen our focus, and I think that's why today is so important to us moving forward. Our teams experience every day the trauma and upheaval natural hazards wreak where they intersect with the communities. The DAP guidelines launched today marks another significant step in how we work together to meet that mission. New South Wales has come a long way in recent years in strengthening its approach to disaster risk reduction, and the DAP guidelines are a key part of that progress, bringing our work into sharper focus and setting a shared path forward. With climate change and population growth continuing to reshape risk right across our cities and regions, we know that disasters will not only affect more people, they'll also be more intense, last longer, and occur more frequently. That's why a coordinated and forward-thinking approach to disaster adaptation planning like this is so vital. The Minister mentioned the State Disaster Mitigation Plan, or the SDMP as we refer to it, and I'd like to give you some more context on this important plan. The SDMP was released in February last year and is the New South Wales Government's blueprint for reducing disaster impacts and costs through 37 targeted actions, grounded in hazard assessments and risk reduction options across every local government area in the state. It focuses on planning reform, critical infrastructure resilience, social cohesion, and importantly, caring for country. New South Wales is leading the way in this proactive approach. Where the SDMP provides a statewide platform, DAP guidelines provide a process to bring depth and detail to a regional scale, where the impacts of natural hazards are shared and can be most effectively mitigated. A key strength of the DAP guidelines and DAPs themselves is collaboration. And that's why it's so important that we've got so many special partners here this morning. As the guidelines make clear, these plans are designed to bring stakeholders together in each region of New South Wales to co-design actions that reduce risk from hazards like floods, bushfires, heat waves, storms and cyclones. We are already delivering on this commitment in the Northern Rivers, in the Hawkesbury and Nepean Valley, and we are working alongside joint organisations in regions across New South Wales in preparatory works. The guidelines create a clear path to aligning local leadership with our broader approach to disaster adaptation planning in New South Wales. Together, we can drive a more integrated and consistent approach to risk reduction, one that recognises local strengths and regional needs whilst contributing to a stronger and more resilient state. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Amanda Leck, RA's Head of Adaptation, Mitigation and Reconstruction, to tell you more about the DAP guidelines and the work we've already underway. Welcome, Amanda.
Thanks so much, Mel, and thank you, Minister Saffin. Not sure if you're still online, but we really appreciate you joining us this morning. And also thank you to Uncle Colin Locke for your beautiful welcome to country. I've been working in the emergency management and disaster resilience sector for nearly 30 years. That's a scary thought in itself. And today's launch and showing you our work around the disaster adaptation planning guidelines and the work of the SDMP is a momentous step towards delivering real and positive change. And I feel very privileged to be in this role and to be able to have a positive impact on how we deal with natural hazards for our communities. And I'm really excited about the potential that disaster adaptation planning in our regions brings. Before I give you an overview of the guidelines, how they'll support disaster adaptation planning and how we'll work with agencies and councils and relevant organisations to develop DAPs, I'll touch on why disaster adaptation planning is so important. As the Minister shared and knows from her own personal experience, New South Wales is no stranger to natural hazards. Our communities continue to feel the impacts of floods, bushfires, storms and coastal erosion. Just this year, we've experienced flooding and destructive winds caused by ex-tropical cyclone Alfred, along with widespread impacts from the more recent East Coast severe weather event. There has never been a more urgent need for coordinated and proactive disaster planning. A community's ability to recover is also heavily dependent on the steps taken ahead of time to prepare, mitigate, or limit the exposure of natural hazards. And as the Minister noted, governments have traditionally spent the majority of funding on recovery and cleaning up after disasters, rather than investing in mitigation beforehand. The NEMA-led Colvin and Glasser reviews have highlighted the need for reform to ease the trauma and burden on communities and to ensure a much better return on investment for governments and communities. The recommendations from both reviews support a strategic shift towards disaster risk reduction and resilience to reduce the impact of disasters on the Australian people. I'm pleased to say New South Wales is already leading in this approach. The very premise of the DAP process is to understand risk, develop ways to mitigate that risk and, if we can't, provide the tools and solutions to help places and communities to adapt. The role and powers of the authority are bedded in legislation and regulation. The New South Wales Reconstruction Authority Act and Regulation 2023. Apart from response, our functions cover the broad spectrum of disaster management, from reducing risk through adaptation and mitigation and preparedness, through to local recovery, reconstruction and disaster funding assistance. And our key focus on reducing risk and supporting adaptation to natural hazards recognises the shift in balance in effort and spending from recovery to being better prepared ahead of the challenges through proactive planning. DAPs supply the State Disaster Mitigation Plan toolkit of measures to reduce our community's exposure and vulnerability to natural hazards. DAPs take a place-based approach to understanding the risk in a region and provide a framework for how we can come together to identify appropriate solutions with all stakeholders. The DAP guidelines we're launching today provide the documented process and support a consistent and streamlined approach for each regional plan. The SDMP targets existing policy and program gaps. Implementation of the 37 actions is well underway, with actions including a statewide framework for evacuation infrastructure capacity, a state policy for large-scale multi-hazard managed relocation, and development of a statewide framework for social cohesion with a focus on natural hazard risk. These statewide interventions unblock and remove obstacles and provide the supportive policy framework for place-based disaster adaptation planning. While the SDMP sets out a program to progress this important policy work, it's really through our place-based DAPs that on-the-ground interventions will be identified and investment priorities established to deliver community-focused risk reduction outcomes. Importantly, both the SDMP and DAPs are given legislative weight through the Reconstruction Authority Act and the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, which require agencies and authorities to have regard to DAPs in the course of their duties, including in strategic planning and development assessment and approvals. We've been working closely with a range of stakeholders for almost 2 years to develop a community-focused and collaborative approach to disaster adaptation planning. This included an 8-week consultation on the draft DAP guidelines in mid-2024 to make sure they were fit for purpose. And I know many online today and in the room have participated in that consultation. Our teams engaged with more than 700 stakeholders from around 250 organisations, including councils, joint organisations, regional organisations of councils, government agencies, industry, private and academic organisations, infrastructure providers and community organisations. We're proud of the consultation that was undertaken, and I'd like to thank everyone who contributed to this process. As the Minister said, we took time to get this right, and what we will read today has been deeply informed by your feedback and input to that process. We heard that local government are key partners in disaster adaptation planning. However, they cannot carry this burden alone. And this is particularly true of councils in regional areas, many of whom have been impacted over and over again by disasters in recent years. The RA must play a coordinating role in delivering hazard insights for our regions. We need to leverage and build on the existing work and plans already underway by councils. The DAP process can identify funding pathways, particularly for betterment. And our stakeholders saw the value in the DAP process to help navigate complex policy roadblocks at the state level. We listened closely to the feedback provided, and the guidelines that you read today are designed to reduce the burden on local government, with the RA taking a leadership role while recognising the key role councils and JOs will take in the process. They also enable actions that may provide early wins to be identified and socialised earlier. The guidelines have been streamlined to a 4-stage process for developing a DAP, and there are now 2 key outputs: a foundation DAP at the 2nd stage and a full DAP that is published at the end of the 3rd stage. We heard clearly that we shouldn't wait to begin implementing actions when they are showing benefits early in the process. So the foundation DAP leverages existing work and early work to progress actions and protect communities sooner, while the detailed work necessary continues to a full DAP. This process builds on the existing work of councils and other organisations to take a multi-hazard, locally shaped, regionally coordinated and state-facilitated approach to disaster adaptation planning. In line with feedback, the guidelines also include language around consideration of water security as a secondary hazard and how these tie in with drought, as well as more detail about the assurance process, governance arrangements and approvals. So you may be asking yourself, what is a DAP? They are developed through a collaborative process to facilitate a shared understanding of natural hazard risk. We want the input of First Nations peoples, communities, industry and government. The process identifies actions that can be taken now to reduce risk and into the future using a robust options assessment process. These actions might include building levees, updating planning controls, upgrading evacuation routes, delivering preparedness programs with our communities, or investing in social infrastructure and nature-based measures. By identifying the most effective ways to reduce risk over the shorter and longer term, DAPs will help guide better decision-making and greater investment in adaptation and mitigation. So what does a disaster adaptation plan really look like? Well, DAPs will be developed and implemented through a 4-stage process. The first stage, readiness, involves the establishment of governance arrangements for effective collaboration, reaching agreement on regional boundaries, and developing project plans and community engagement plans. Stage 2, understanding regional risk and early actions, involves compiling a regional risk profile, identifying the community's values and vision, and identifying and screening risk reduction options. This is where the foundation DAP is delivered, which includes those early actions for implementation. Stage 3, the adaptation and mitigation options assessment, involves developing and assessing risk reduction options and publishing a full DAP. The final stage involves implementing and monitoring the actions identified in the DAP collaboration with relevant organisations. During DAP development, each stage will be assured, and community and stakeholder engagement will continue throughout the whole process. We know that drawing on the strengths and experiences of communities is crucial to understanding how natural hazards impact people and places. In cities and towns across New South Wales, there are already community-led activities happening on the ground to improve how communities prepare for and adapt to natural hazards. The guidelines acknowledge that better outcomes are achieved when we all work together and share knowledge to address risk. This is reinforced through the DAP governance arrangements, which include community engagement forums and a regional steering committee formed in the early stages of DAP development. The DAP process will help to improve region-wide capability, build preparedness, and deepen community understanding of natural hazard risk. For the development of the Hawkesbury-Nepean Valley DAP, we worked with community partners and organisations to increase awareness about the work of the DAP. This included collaborating with a local school and its passionate principal to deliver incursions across the valley to 20 of the highest risk schools. The program raised risk awareness amongst young people and empowered them to become preparedness champions, sharing what they learnt with their school communities and families. It also included Aboriginal art and storytelling sessions that blended climate science with traditional knowledge and dreaming stories. The highlight of the program for me were the 2 hackathons, and you can see the photo on the screen now, where teams of students learnt from experts and were challenged to create a preparedness campaign for their community. Our partners for this event included New South Wales SES, the Bureau of Meteorology, and our own RA flood experts. Their creativity and passion for protecting friends and families was incredible. I had the pleasure of judging the hackathon, and I have to tell you, it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to judge, and was amazed by the impactful and innovative ideas developed and presented by these bright young minds. We need to support and facilitate programs like this across our regions to build broader understanding of risk at all levels. Tapping into existing networks and empowering and supporting them to work with the communities they serve is a simple yet effective step in building awareness and preparedness from the ground up. Alongside community engagement, robust data is vital to understand regional risk. It was in your feedback on the guidelines that councils indicated they needed assistance with doing this. The SGMP provides the state's first high-level multi-hazard view of the risk profile in New South Wales now and into the future. And this intelligence is vital to prioritising resources and supporting smart decision-making. The guidelines acknowledge the data and information management and sharing of insights are critical to effective disaster adaptation planning. We're delivering on that ambition through the development of centralised disaster risk data and intelligence capability, an important initiative under Action 31 of the State Disaster Mitigation Plan. Dr. DIP, as we affectionately call it, integrates hazard, exposure and vulnerability data to quantify risk. This platform combines statewide data from government, research and industry, STMP actions and DAP processes to provide valuable risk assessment insights. Of course, understanding risk can't rest on data that reveals the potential height of a flood or likelihood of bushfire movements. Dr. DIP combines data on the likelihood and extent of natural hazards with who is exposed to the risk and how they might be impacted by various natural hazards. It will be an invaluable tool for future regional disaster adaptation planning. As you've heard this morning from the Minister and from Mal, we already have 2 DAPs underway. While we're officially launching the guidelines now, we've been working on these DAPs, the Hawkesbury and Nepean Valley DAP for 2 years and the Northern Rivers DAP for the past year. And we're also supporting disaster adaptation planning in a further 5 regions. The RA recently delivered the flood-focused draft foundation Hawkesbury and Nepean Valley DAP to the Minister, and work is well underway on the multi-hazard DAP for the Northern Rivers, with the foundation DAP due to be delivered to the Minister by the end of June in 2026. We've been describing this as a bit like building the plane while we're flying it, but the high risks in those regions meant we couldn't delay action. In fact, working in parallel has worked in our favour because our hands-on work on those DAPs has helped to inform the guidelines, and our strategic thinking on process and procedure has greatly strengthened the current DAP development. It also positioned us to support disaster adaptation planning in the Central West, the Hunter, Central Coast, Riverina Murray, and Southeast and Tablelands regions. And we're already collaborating with those JOs who have received disaster ready funding as part of round 2 to do that work. The Hawkesbury and Nepean Valley DAP is a single hazard and prioritised due to the region's significant flood risk, covering 8 local government areas. There is no single solution to reduce all flood risk in the region, so the draft foundation DAP assesses a range of measures to reduce or adapt to risk in line with the tools identified in the State Disaster Mitigation Plan. This includes mitigation infrastructure such as levees, improvements to evacuation roads, different ways to manage Warragamba Dam, improved warning systems, and communication and community preparedness and awareness campaigns. We also know that insurance is a key enabler to support risk reduction, and we've heard from the community, councils and other organisations in the HNV that insurance is a real pain point for our communities and is essential for effective recovery. The RA recently undertook statewide household research into flood insurance with a focus on the HNV and Northern Rivers. Having this data and increased understanding of how households make decisions about insurance and what this looks like across the state will allow us to work collaboratively with NEMA's Hazard Insurance Partnership Project and industry. This includes making a case for mitigation actions to be reflected in reduced premiums, which may be an outcome of DAPs. As the Minister shared earlier, after almost 2 years of intensive work in consultation with key agencies, floodplain councils, and the communities who live and work in the catchment, the HNV DAP has reached the end of stage 2 of the process. And I'd like to acknowledge many in this room who've contributed to that work and to thank them for the collaborative way that that work has been progressed. The draft foundation Hawkesbury and Nepean DAP includes a range of early actions that can be progressed, while analysis continues on more complex mitigation and evacuation options. Once endorsed, it will be released for consultation, and we look forward to hearing what you think. We are working towards delivering the full DAP in 2026. In the Northern Rivers, we are working on our first multi-hazard DAP covering 7 local government areas and 4 water catchments. The RA is collaborating with local councils and key community resilience stakeholders to identify strengths, challenges and opportunities across the region. We've established a DAP coordinator network of local councils and a Northern Rivers flood risk management practitioners group by way of example. Our Northern Rivers team are collaborating with business and industry to understand economic impacts, with surveys and roundtables held in April and May to help inform an economic baseline report. And 2 early risk reduction projects are underway. a flood risk awareness campaign with the New South Wales SES, local councils and the Australian Red Cross, and a project to deliver the first flood evacuation model for the region. We will soon be setting up a community reference group and running a series of community values workshops, embedding community and priorities into how we identify and assess further risk reduction options. So what have we learned? Lessons learned in the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley and the Northern Rivers have helped us to understand what works and how we can build a scalable model for the rest of New South Wales. We've learned that to solve complex problems, we need to bring all the relevant stakeholders to the table. We've learned the value of cross-sector collaboration. By working across state agencies and with infrastructure and industry partners, we've been able to identify risks to critical assets and services and design initiatives that address those risks in a practical, coordinated way. We've also learned to leverage what's already there. By tapping into existing governance structures and stakeholder forums, we've reduced consultation fatigue and built on our existing relationships. We also acknowledge the deep knowledge Aboriginal communities hold about natural hazards and country. The guidelines call for early, culturally appropriate engagement to ensure all communities are key partners in the DAP process. We have work underway to identify practices for enabling Aboriginal participation in the DAP process, building on the work of the Aboriginal Communities Emergency Management Program. And perhaps most importantly, we've seen the power of community engagement. When we involve communities early and often, we ground our plans in local knowledge and lived experience, leading to more inclusive, effective, and sustainable outcomes. The DAP guidelines provide a clear framework for implementing these learnings, and they mark a significant change in how we prepare for and respond to natural hazards. We look forward to continuing to drive this important work forward. Let's keep working together to make sure communities in New South Wales are stronger, safer, and more resilient into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. And I'm sure you can see the enormous amount of work that has gone into today, and certainly the momentous day it is to be able to launch the DAP guidelines. I really like to congratulate Amanda and her team for the work that they've put in to get us to where we are, and certainly for your leadership in taking this really important piece of work forward. You can see how multifaceted it's been, how keen we have been to make sure that there has been engagement and inclusion right through the process, and why it's so important to have you here today. We're now going to move into a very exciting part of the morning, which is a panel discussion. I'm going to give Amanda 2 minutes to get a breath back, as she will be facilitating the session. And in doing so, I'd like to welcome our panel members. As I introduce you, if you wouldn't mind coming to the stage and take a seat, and then we'll work our way through it. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists who will bring diverse perspectives to the adaptation planning space. Please make your way to the front. I'll actually introduce you individually because it's more important that you get recognition as you come up. Councillor Phyllis Miller, OAM, President of Local Government New South Wales and Mayor of Forbes. Local Government New South Wales has been a strong advocate for councils in the DAP guidelines process. And for those who know Phyllis, she is a very strong advocate for community. Many of you might know that the Central West has been heavily impacted by flooding and disaster events in recent times, and Mayor Miller is a strong voice to the government for doing better. Thanks for being here this morning, Mayor. Charlotte Nicol, Acting Assistant Coordinator General, Strategy and Resilience. Amanda Coughlin, my apologies. Good morning. Representing NEMA this morning, the National Emergency Management Agency. Amanda is a great advocate for working together, and the states and the Commonwealth to actually do what we're doing need to work closely together. For those that are unaware, obviously with some of the more recent disaster events, in particular Tropical Cyclone Alfred, the partnership between the National Emergency Management Agency and the Reconstruction Authority has been essential in making sure we support communities. We're very honoured to have Amanda here this morning, and her perspective from the Commonwealth will be incredibly important. Ollie Costello is a Bundjalung man from the Northern Rivers and is Executive Director of the Jagan Alliance, an Aboriginal owned and directed not-for-profit organisation and registered charity. He has also been appointed to the Net Zero Commission. Ollie has been on the front line of supporting his community recover and is passionate advocate and exemplar of the benefits of bringing First Nations knowledge to disaster mitigation. Good morning, Ollie, and thanks for joining us. Steve Hartley is Executive Director, Resilience and Urban Sustainability with the Department of Planning, Housing and Infrastructure. Steve's work focuses on the intersection of natural hazards and people, and he understands implicitly the importance of cross-agency collaboration. Thanks for joining us, Steve. And finally, but definitely not last, Elizabeth Richardson is Hawkesbury City Council's GM. Elizabeth has walked alongside her community as they battle bushfires and successive flood events. And obviously the work that is being done in Hawkesbury and Nepean Valley is incredibly important to Council. She knows better than most how difficult it is for councils to grapple with the impacts of natural hazards on people and infrastructure. Hopefully Amanda's managed to get her voice back, so I now welcome Amanda back to the stage to facilitate. Thank you. Oh. Sorry, ladies and gents, I'm working on some notes that I did not update, so my apologies. Welcome, Penny. It's lovely to have you with us. Amanda, if I could just have you.
Thanks so much, Mel, and I'm really pleased to be able to facilitate this panel discussion this morning where we've brought together people who work from all aspects of disaster management. Many of them are key partners of the RA, and we thought it was really important for our audience to hear from that diverse range of experience and expertise around, the importance of the DAP guidelines and to be clear about the strategic approach that they represent for New South Wales. I do have some questions for the panel, but I'd also like to have an opportunity to hear from those of you who are here in the audience today. I will take some hands up later as well if you can't work the tech. For those online, there's a Slido link that's been placed into the chat as well, and you can see that on the screen here. So please feel free, vote up questions as they are asked by others, or contribute your own questions to that discussion, and we'll get to some of those questions as the morning progresses. But first of all, I'm going to ask each of the panellists the same question, and just to get their perspective on the launch of the DAP guidelines today. So the DAP guidelines outline a new and innovative approach to disaster adaptation and mitigation in New South Wales. What are some of the challenges you are all experiencing as we see an increasing number of disasters in New South Wales? And how do you think we can shift the dial for greater investment in risk reduction? Do you think the DAP guidelines will help us to do that?
Yes, so first of all, congratulations to everybody involved in the release of the DAP guidelines. It's a tremendous milestone and great to be here. Yeah, I think, one of the things that we really struggle with as electricity and energy providers is actually getting access to data and information. And for example, something that might seem quite simple, such as flood data, we can go online and access PDFs, but to be able to get, that kind of information through, as a GIS layer, or to be able to map it across our critical service will be really helpful and important. So I'm hoping and looking forward to that as part of the DAP process.
Thanks, Penny. And to you, Elizabeth?
Thanks, Amanda. My pleasure to be here today. I think in terms of what we've experienced in the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley and at Hawkesbury City Council, what we are adjusting to is with the increasing number of disasters is that this is now reflective of our BAU and our new normal, so to speak. So that has been something that we are learning and will continue to be an ongoing challenge for us, simply because I think after the 2021 and the 2022 flood events, we upscaled our organisation, enabling the recovery, both in terms of our infrastructure and our community. What we have discovered through that is that we really now need to focus onto that resilience piece while we are also in recovery. What I guess we would be hopeful for is that, and the foundation that the DAP process provides, is that we are really linking here a set of strategic drivers driven off national strategy down through the SDMP, through that process there, then allows us to use these local and regional plans as an opportunity to start to leverage in some of those resilience aspects that I think we haven't really had the opportunity to do to date.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And to you, Steve.
Thanks, Amanda, and I reiterate the congratulations to everyone who's been involved in the development and delivery of the guidelines. I think one of your first slides, Amanda, had it really well, and that was that at the moment 3% of investment goes towards resilience and 97% goes into some form of recovery. We've got different level of maturity frameworks for all sorts of hazards. From a planning perspective, we have to continue to make decisions, but we also have to recognise that climate change, as Mal has said, is increasing the intensity and frequency of the disasters our communities face. And the government's clearly signalled about the housing crisis and the priority. Balancing those things requires taking that information, making decisions about that information for the best that we can do for community now and into the future. The DAP guidelines allow us to bring that information together, to have a framework that provides a voice for community, for government, for investment, and from a planning perspective to help make better decisions into the future.
Thanks, Steve. And Ollie.
Firstly, Jingle Blagami, Elena Garama Jagun Garama Mibad. So yeah, as we care for country, country cares for us. I want to thanks Uncle for the warm welcome. I don't know a lot of Darug, so I'm speaking a bit of Bunjalung. Yeah, I guess just so important that we reflect on the country and the custodianship of our old people. And as well, now's a bit of a hard time for us up home. One of our uncles passed away on the weekend, so we've got a lot of sorry business. And that in some ways it's kind of part of the story that we're all here for, in a sense that, disasters, in the same way sorry business help us reflect on the things that we can do better and the things that we can learn from each other. And so much of the work is also understanding what's working and what we need to continue to do and how we can support good practice. And so I've had a bit of a flick through the guide and the guidelines, and it is going to be helpful, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here and contribute to the panel. And there's just so much work that we need to do. Disasters, natural hazards, they're not new things, and we think of them as being bad, but they're not all bad. And so part of the work is understanding, and that's the part of adaptation, is tuning in and understanding how something like losing someone which makes us sad, and disaster can bring a lot of trauma. But how do we turn that into good? How do we learn and respect the legacy of the people that pass, or the impacts? Fire is our ancestors, water, these things that we get overwhelmed by, they also give us everything that we need to survive, the light from the sun and the water and all these things. So it's about balance and relationships. So hopefully, as people understand, and the guidelines I think will help to tune people in the country and community and understand how we have to learn faster and do more than we've ever had to do before, because the changes are happening much faster and bigger. And so I guess I lost my track there. I probably should stop, because I could keep going and going and going. But I guess the main thing I wanted to get to, is that part of the challenge is that investment, is understanding. And so much of my work is about we have to, be doing all the things we can do before the bad things happen. And then when they happen, we have to do the best we can with what we have. So we need more investment, but it's not just about other money or new ideas and stuff. It's also doing things with what we have and being able to change our practice. And I think the work that we've been doing around fire, in particular, and our river work, is an example of that. So, people always want us to use fire to reduce risk, and that, yeah, when you burn things, you reduce risk, but that's not why we burn culturally. We burn culturally because fire belongs, to country, and there's parts where we burn and we make the country healthier. So not only do we reduce risk, we actually increase biodiversity, food production, we're doing all these other things. And so when we think about adaptation, disaster adaptation, it's about health, education, justice. It's about understanding we have to redistribute our effort in community, and that'll help us solve these other problems, so we can't box ourselves into dealing with a disaster. It's about community resilience and being able to adapt our practice, in practicing our knowledge and turning our knowledge into action. And so that's what I hope the guidelines will help us do, is get more community perspectives into caring for country and learning from country and being able to apply that into our economies in our communities.
Thanks so much, Ollie. To Phyllis.
Thank you. I'm representing local government, and I'm an oldie in local government. For 30 years, we've been trying to get some betterment. But before I say any more, I'm very excited about having Amanda Leck doing the work that she's doing with her experience. And of course, Mal has been fantastic to us out in the Central West. We've had our fair share of disasters out there. These disaster adaptation plans are something that we have lobbied for a long time. You can call it whatever you like, but it's about planning for the risk of flooding and doing those better things. We have been putting the same road back for 30 years and it's been washing away. And then we've had people that have been isolated for 6 months. This is the greatest thing that I have ever seen in relation to flooding. One thing about this, and I just want to give you an example of, you have a disaster, everyone's trying to help everyone out. There's people that have lost their homes, they're living in high flood areas. For instance, recently I went up to Northern Rivers. Now, I keep in contact with all of those mayors, so I actually get their whinges and I get their really good things that they're happy with. When I walked around with our CEO, David Reynolds, and we had a look at the homes that have been purchased, they've got fences in front of them, they've got squatters inside of them. That was something that was done without thinking, where will those people go and where will they build? And we don't want the same thing to happen out in the Central West. As you know, Mal, in Eugowra, that's a real focus that we get that right out there. I think having disaster adaptation plans is going to stop those decisions that can be made politically very quickly without thinking of the consequences. My view is all of those lovely people that are squatting up there, give them a licence, because then they've got a time frame where you can end that licence and you can get them out. But do something with that. So I am here today very excited about disaster adaptation plans, and I want to thank the government for bringing them forward, and I can't wait to get ours finished.
Thanks so much. And Amanda.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Look, congratulations to New South Wales R8, everyone involved in what is a fantastic set of guidelines. From a Commonwealth perspective, this most recent high-risk weather season's been the most significantly active season since 2018-19. And I think we're seeing repeatedly now communities hit with a cycle of response and recovery, and the number of communities experiencing that is growing. I think we talked a little bit about where the emphasis of investment is around recovery. Also just wanted to share that Amanda mentioned this morning the independent review of Commonwealth disaster funding done by Andrew Colvin. That review identified that the disaster costs are estimated to grow to $40.3 billion by 2050. That doesn't actually include any consideration of climate impacts on those disasters, so it's quite a conservative estimate. That review and this conversation, the disaster adaptation guidelines, the experiences of communities all say we need to do things differently. And I think looking at different ways to manage disasters, because our environment has changed so significantly. The disaster adaptation guidelines that are being launched today are at the forefront of this, and I think they do some things incredibly well. They recognise that solving the complex considerations around disaster management is a whole of nation problem, and really put partnerships at the centre of that, clearly identifying the roles that everyone can play and providing the tools to enable communities all the way up to state government to deliver on that. They also provide a clear framework for risk and evidence to drive better decision making. So actually understanding where that investment in risk reduction and adaptation needs to go, and having evidence-informed decisions that build a link between government decision-making and community-empowered place-based decision-making in a really clear framework. I think the other thing that really struck me about the guidelines is the focus around looking not just at current disaster risk, but future risk. So actually incorporating climate adaptation into the guidelines, I think, is really powerful. And the Australian government has really recognised the link between disaster risk reduction, disaster adaptation and climate adaptation. So for the National Emergency Management Agency, we have an Assistant Minister appointed for the first time. That Assistant Minister is also the Assistant Minister for Climate Adaptation. So really recognising the link between those two agendas. So I think this is a fantastic body of work. Congratulations to everybody involved, and it's a real pleasure to be here today.
Thanks so much, Amanda. I have some specific questions for the panellists now, and then we will go to the audience questions. So please keep those questions coming on Slido, or if you're in the audience and don't want to use the tech, please get ready with the hands up. So I'll go to you first, Steve. We know that land use planning is a vital tool to reduce future natural hazard risk, but we also know the government is faced with demand for more housing. And in fact, it is, the New South Wales government key policy priority. How can we support growth in appropriate locations and enable more housing supply that doesn't put more people in harm's way?
Thanks, Amanda. A really good question we get asked all the time, and I know that you and your staff also get asked all the time. I think one of the really interesting aspects of that question is there is no black and white answer. I think long ago government stopped solving really simple problems. There's not many left, and if there are, please give them to me. I'd like to have a go. The complexity of what we're talking about is the thing that underpins, I think, that question. I don't think anyone is saying don't build any more houses. I don't think anyone is saying you can stop natural disasters if you do X. It is not a simple black and white answer. To me, at the heart of this question is really one of the actions that's outlined in the State Disaster Mitigation Plan, and that's around tolerable risk. Tolerable risk, we've talked about it in different guises, even in the introductory comments. It's around recognising that complexity. It's about having the information to underpin a detailed and proper discussion about how you balance those things. I mean, I was thinking you could almost do a poll around the audience, put your hand up, anyone who's jaywalked, don't. But we make decisions about tolerable risk in our daily lives all the time. And every decision we make in our professional capacities, we bring that judgment to the debate. And I think that, to me, is the critical part of being able to meet those dual objectives of providing more housing whilst also reducing the risk that people face. I've got kids. I want my kids to be able to stay in Sydney. I'd love that. Housing is really, really expensive. I don't know where they could go. I also don't want them to face a future that is beset with continual disaster, where they have to respond every time and their resilience dips and dips and dips. To me, that's the concept of tolerable risk writ large. I think the DAP guidelines provide us, as I said in my opening comments, the DAP guidelines actually provide us the ability to have that conversation with community, across government, with industry, about the balance between recognising past development patterns, risk based on all of the natural hazards that we face, what we want for a region for the future, what mitigation infrastructure is needed, ultimately where you can put more people, how you can put people there, how you can put them safely, and how you can put them in a way that actually builds community. And so it is not a simple answer. It is a complex problem. It's a problem I think that we can face together. And for me, it's based on that concept of what is tolerable risk and how do you bring all of these different perspectives together so that you can get to the outcome of more housing, better housing in the right place at a lower level of risk and a higher level of resilience.
Thanks, Steve. And look, having worked in this sector for a long time, if the answers were simple, we would have found that by now there's enough clever people have turned their minds to this problem. And I think, as you say, the DAP guidelines help us to deal with that complexity and that sort of balancing those competing policy priorities. So thanks for your reflections there. I'm going to go back to you now, Phyllis. So In your capacity here as President of Local Government New South Wales, we do know councils have been hit particularly hard by natural disaster events, with more than 110 declared natural disasters in the last 5 years, affecting 65 local council areas in the last financial year alone. So that's communities impacted over and over again. How do you see the approach outlined in the guidelines helping councils across regions to reduce risk?
Thanks, Amanda, and that's a great question. I think we've always, the councils, as much as we get bagged about the things we do, most of us have inherited anything that's built on a floodplain. I can categorically say it was there long before I was born, and we're coping with that and we're trying to deal with that. I think this is something that local government has been asking for. We haven't called it DAPS, but we've said, can we do some long-term planning? Can we start to, lower our risk when we're having a flood? So we've been having this conversation with governments, and I can honestly say this is the first time we've been heard. And I know in 2022, when we had our biggest flood ever out in the Central West in Forbes, we had Minister Dibb and Minister Scully out there. And my first thing to them was say, can we start to do some planning so that we can start to get some betterment and we can start to lower our risk when we're flooding? And this is exactly what DAPS are doing. Local government is excited about being part of this process. It's very important that we let this process grow, because there will be things that's not quite right. So we need to keep listening to each other and making sure that over time we get these plans absolutely fantastic. So I'm excited, Amanda. I think there's a great opportunity. We are the planners for communities. We're very reliant on our planning staff in guiding us to make good decisions, and we certainly want to do the right thing by our communities.
Thanks so much. I want to go to someone who's got lived experience. So Elizabeth has been involved in the development of that first state disaster adaptation plan for the Hawkesbury and Nepean Valley. So can you reflect, Elizabeth, on how you have found the experience, and do you believe the resulting DAP will reflect your community's priorities?
Thanks very much, Amanda. You touched on it earlier where you mentioned that we were building the plane while trying to fly it at the same time. And I think for the context of this, I think RA was formed late 2022. That provided the enabling legislation for the DAPS. And then obviously the 2022 flood events meant that in 2023, when we commenced work on this, we were very much still in recovery mode at that particular point in time. And I think it's probably fair to say the RA, where you were still in a storming, forming kind of a norming environment at that point too. I will say that our staff have very much enjoyed collaborating with other levels of government, sharing data, expertise, lived experience with their peers in that space. As a real opportunity now to be, we were piloting. I think that's fair to say. We were in a pilot type environment where we're right at that bleeding edge of trying to understand how we can bring about meaningful investment in risk reduction in New South Wales. So very, very excited and working with both community and our staff on that. In terms of will it reflect our priorities, I wouldn't see any reason why it shouldn't. Obviously, we're very keen to get our eyes on it, Amanda. But we're certainly cautiously optimistic. There's no reason why our staff have had considerable input, certainly early on in the process. Myself and the Mayor sit on a community leaders forum where we've had opportunities to review aspects of the plan, and we are very much hopeful that foundation DAP, when that is sent out for community consultation, has the ability to address not only regional-based priorities, but we're also keen to see how that will look at our more local and niche ones also.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I'm going to go to you now, Ollie. So we know that First Nations consultation is vital to the success of disaster adaptation planning, not just because there is such rich cultural knowledge to draw on, but also because we know Aboriginal communities are disproportionately impacted by disaster events. Based on the work you've been doing in the Northern Rivers with the RA, and we've been working really closely with the Jaguar Alliance, and thank you for that, How should we approach First Nations consultation in disaster adaptation planning?
Thanks, Amanda. Yes, and yeah, very grateful for the opportunities we've had to work with RA. It was, I guess, it was kind of imposed on us a bit in a way initially, and so, but yeah, it's been great. I think building that relationship, we've sort of grown up together a little bit in a way with these disasters, and I think these things can be super tokenistic or they can be very authentic, and that's kind of the challenge and the opportunity. I was sort of joking around yesterday to someone about you need a token to make the machine work, but in all truth, First Nations communities, are now more vulnerable, but that's not our legacy. That's not the way our culture works. That's us adapting and drawing on our deep resilience to survive colonisation. And so we're used to systems failing, but we also know systems work. We're all here breathing the air the ancestors, the trees make for us, and that system's been working for us for a long time. But we've been growing up in systems that keep failing us. That's been my lived experience. And so, the only way we can deal with a failing system is leadership. People have to step up, and that's kind of the disaster resilience story for most communities, is that people step up because the system is failing, and then we draw from that leadership. That comes at a high cost, and so that's part of the work is understanding that there's leadership in the community. Sometimes it needs to be developed and supported, but we actually need to build the systems around people to support them, where the guidelines will be a part of that story. And understand that, what we see is a vulnerable community, and, that's, RA and other parts of government are forced to engage Aboriginal communities because they're most impacted, and often because they're dependent on these systems like public and community housing and different sort of legacies of colonisation and dependencies that are created. But then how do we unlock that inherent knowledge and power and resilience through understanding, shifting from a vulnerability to a strength? Like I said before, like disasters can be bad things. They can also be good. They can teach us, the rainbow serpent, Barmy, like Waba, like all these sort of, like the landscape's been shaped by fire and water. All people have got stories about it. We can go to Cabbage Tree Island, and see the community that's been displaced for 3 years or more now, and we can walk up the hill to where the sea used to be, Ngunya Juggle and the IPA, where we've been applying, looking after and caring for that country. We can talk about the, what's happening in the landscape. So being able to kind of make sure that we've got authentic engagement, the work we've been doing together, like the Good Fire Gathering Project, Fire, the Heal the Rivers Project, with the Caring for Country, sort of the Connecting Countries framework. So we're building out these pieces of work that is relying on leadership, and we need to make sure that we're supporting communities across the state and beyond to become those leaders in their communities and provide the solutions that are going to be what they need to draw on when the system fails us, and we have to be able to step up.
Thanks, Ollie. And I think that's a really great point you make about leadership. And I think it's critical to have leadership at every level, at community scale, within governments, within local councils. That is what is going to deal with what is to come for all of us. And I'll go to you, Amanda. You did touch on it before, but, there was two pretty major independent reviews last year, the Glasser review into sort of governance, and then the Colvin review that looked at, the changing risk landscape and what we needed to do to sustainably go forward. How do you see the State Disaster Mitigation Plan and RA's work on disaster adaptation planning working in concert with those, key recommendations? Do you think that we're on the right track to deliver the reforms supported by these inquiries?
Thanks so much for that question, Amanda. So just to provide a little bit of context, I think the systems that we've used to manage disasters in Australia have served us well for a long time, but they were really many components of them designed to manage one severe event a season. That's clearly not the environment in which we're currently in. And so the reviews can then explore that and try and identify what is the roadmap that we need going forward. Both the Colvin and the Glasser review, while one focused on funding and one focused on governance, recognise that changes to how we get together and make decisions and how we fund recovery, risk reduction, both at the Commonwealth level and nationally, changes to those systems is not enough. So there actually requires, both reviews recommend fundamental system change to actually make sure that we're clear about the outcomes that we're setting, to really help us understand where that prioritised investment needs to go, that we're really strengthening the evidence and the data underneath it so we understand the risk exposure, the vulnerability, the impact of disasters on communities, but also the capacity across the country to respond and recover to those communities. They also clearly highlighted the need to shift how we manage disasters from an approach that is largely reactive to one that really looks at investment in risk reduction, both before and after an event, and providing a clear link between those two things. So at the moment, we invest in risk reduction, particularly through things like the Disaster Ready Fund, which we've heard some references to today. We have disaster recovery funding arrangements that with impacted jurisdictions support recovery. They also support elements of what we call betterment or a post-event risk reduction, but there's no relationship between those two things. So one is very event-driven and one is driven under a different set of guidelines. They also clearly identified the need to have a really good monitoring and evaluation framework around our investments. So how do we know we're doing things right and the right things, and how are we looking at the benefits of that investment and then evolving what we do over time? So alongside clear kind of recommendations about reducing risk, setting clear outcomes, building that data and evidence base, and rethinking how we fund and invest in disasters with a greater focus on risk reduction, they also called out the need for clear roles and responsibilities and to change the way we make national decisions. So I think the DAP guidelines are really closely aligned with all of those recommendations, including how we actually look at risk at the local level, risk at the state level, risk at the national level, and build a much clearer picture about how we're making those decisions around investment. And I think the Glasser review also really emphasised the need to change the way we think about partnerships and the way we change the national conversation. So because the Glasser review was commissioned by the National Emergency Management Ministers meeting, we've implemented a number of those recommendations. That includes bringing people like Mel and our recovery leads to the table. It also includes reshaping our ministerial forums to bring ministers like Minister Saffin and Minister Leck from Queensland who lead on recovery. That's really changing the nature of the national conversation and how we make decisions as well, because as we've talked about, addressing those complex those problems really requires clear partnership. Both reviews also called out the real importance of understanding that everybody is part of that system, not-for-profits who deliver really critical services, communities, First Nations communities, and thinking differently about how we partner and engage. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of where those reviews are at, if I may. So the Australian government and the National Emergency Management Ministers meeting publicly released both reviews in October last year. Since that point, they've been doing a lot of consultations. So talking with states, with territories, with the Australian Local Government Association and its association members, with First Nations people, working also through youth hackathons to engage with the youth community as well, and people living with disability. All of that information is really informing the thinking of the Australian government about how we tackle these complex reforms. So they're taking a very considered approach to how we consider those, what the right things are to do as we go forward. And so we are still kind of in that space where the Australian government is really considering those reforms. But I would just highlight that doesn't mean that we're not continuing to evolve what we do. So we're continuing to work collaboratively to change the way we look at the disaster recovery funding arrangements, to continue to evolve the Disaster Ready Fund, including through community consultation and feedback, and continuing to work with insurers through the Hazard Insurance Partnership to look at good ways to actually identify the risk reduction investment individuals can make and how they can actually be taken into consideration around premiums. So we're continuing to advance reforms while we consider what this major system reform might look like in the future. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Amanda. We've got quite a few questions have come through on Slido. I think there's a couple that I will need to answer, and it is the highest voted question, so I will turn my mind to that. So we've been asked, what are the proposed timelines for each DAP stage, and when will this commence in each region? We were reluctant to put a time frame into the guidelines because the critical thing is we work with those local regions at their pace. So some regions and JOs are, willing and able to engage with us on disaster adaptation planning. And in fact, 5 JOs applied for disaster ready funding to do that work in advance of the guidelines even being released. They knew that there was going to be guidelines and they wanted to be front-footed about it, and they have actively started to work with the RA. We think it will take around about 2 years to deliver that foundation DAP piece of work. So that's, establishing the regional governance, the community engagement, the community panels that will inform that really important values piece around what communities' values are, and therefore that will inform what those mitigation options may be. So we didn't want to time bound it because we don't want it to be sort of a mark your scorecard. Yes, you achieved that in 2 years. No, you didn't. But we think that, around 2 years for that first foundation DAP, and then maybe another year or so to do that really detailed optioneering, flood risk modelling, bushfire risk modelling and the like to inform that final DAP. But those are indicative timeframes. In terms of when we'll commence with each region, as and when those regions really are able to work with the RA, and as we have the capacity to do so. I think you reflected, Elizabeth, we're a fairly new organisation. I'm nearly 2 years into my role here, and we are already working with 7 regions across the state, which I think is a pretty powerful reflection of the New South Wales government's commitment to this work. So, we think it'll be more likely a sort of a 10-year rolling program as we get to every region in the state. We've also had a question around the Risk Data Hub, or Dr. DIP as we like to call it, the Disaster Risk and Data Insights platform. We have a team of very keen minds working on delivering that Dr. DIP toward the end of this year. Our plan is to be able to provide access to those who need it to make those risk-informed decisions. That is one of the key priorities in the National Disaster Risk Reduction Framework, which responds to the Sendai framework, which the Minister spoke to. People can't make risk-informed decisions if they don't have the risk information to hand. So we want to make sure that it's in the hands of those who need it. Does that mean every community member will get it? No, but we want to make sure that councils and those who are starting to make these decisions in regions have access to the information they need to make those decisions. So that's the first couple of most highly voted questions online. I might now go to the audience. We have a question over here. Sorry. First one over here. You'll be next, Gary.
Thanks, Amanda. Sam Kernahan from the Committee for Sydney. Firstly, congratulations on the launch of the guidelines. They're really phenomenal piece of work, and congratulations to you and your team for putting it all together, and to those who are already testing them on the ground. I guess my question, sort of building on the comments from Phyllis and others about investment, and particularly around betterment, but also the guidelines speak to benefit management and the relationship with New South Wales Treasury. Could you just talk to both Amanda but also others how you might see these guidelines unlocking investment from Treasury, both at New South Wales and federal level potentially, but also from others, from the private sector, from insurers and others, and utilities, of course?
Thanks, Sam. I'm keen to hear from our panellists. So I think, Phyllis, you might have a view on how government investment could be unlocked for local councils.
Thank you. That is a great question. I think by having a plan and having a way forward, a lot of times, and I'm in local government and I know our faults and I know our good points, we'll often go and say we want money for this and we've got no idea what that's going to do for us. By having a disaster adaptation plan has to put some science and rigour behind any of our asks to Treasury at either the federal or the state level. And I think that we now need to be very accountable on how we get our money for our disaster recovery, because let's face it, what I've watched over the last 3 years, the federal government, state government and local government, none of us have got the money to fix it all up overnight. So unless there's some rigour behind what our asks are when we go to Treasury, I believe that we're just going to be falling flat on our face. So this is giving us an opportunity to have that rigour.
Thanks, Phyllis. Would anyone else like to respond?
I've got a few comments. Yeah, I think it's so critical that we get some of this stuff in a better position. And I think, like before, I was trying to talk about the co-benefits and understanding, like we need to better prioritise our, adaptation investments, but understand the other benefits they bring, and also how do we then leverage other investments in other areas that support disaster adaptation as well. So we don't always have to be focusing on disaster. We can be focusing on the multiple benefits of different ways of investing in infrastructure and community. Obviously got to be focused on nature-based solutions, but that's some of the work that we'll be doing at Jagun and with RA and others. And we've got a DRF funding, the Good Fire Gathering, and previous recovery funding, looking at building a cultural fire economy, because the current sort of economy around fire, isn't working, and so how do we create, because once again, there's other ways that people might want to invest and support that. And that's also other hats at the Net Zero Commission, like our objective is to, support the state to get to net zero by 2050, but also climate adaptation is a big, and that's my particular interest. So how do we understand the intersections between climate adaptation, disaster, other parts, and being able to build the evidence base, because we know we need more investment, but we also need to build the business case to Treasury and insurance and other private sector. And there are other markets, emerging, like nature repair market and carbon markets, that might become places that we can get other investment, nature-based solutions that help reduce risk and vice versa. So being able to understand that holistic landscape and being able to then use the guidelines and local, like local stories, local knowledge, local landscapes, what is the solution that they need locally that's going to help drive that investment going forward? I think that's a really critical pathway that we need to be really ensuring is clear, because it's going to get harder and harder. There's always less money and there's more risk coming. So we have to work out how we're going to be able to support that growth.
Thanks, Ollie. And I think, Penny, you wanted to answer that?
Yes. So this regulatory period has been the first time where Ausgrid has been investing particularly for climate change resilience. And so one of the things that we've done very early on is set up an assurance framework, and it has sort of different stages. And we did that, deliberately, because we wanted to build trust with the regulator to get us permission to do more. So what we are doing is we've got an assurance program that says, did we actually do what we said we would do? And then the second step of that, did the solutions work if we did put them in? And every time we deviate from that principle, we actually have a customer consultative committee, and we actually have deliberately, we go to them and we explain in a transparent way why we've changed course. So an example would be in our bushfire program, where we've decided to move away from composite poles to bushfire wraps, because we could deliver more, we could do it more efficiently in our operating area. And so we just be transparent about that. Just to the second part of your question, which was how will that help you do more? I think back to my earlier comment about the importance of defining roles is really important. The reason for that with us is that, there's sort of, when we go through our regulatory framework, we're sort of applying postage stamp pricing to the changes. The difference between being able to, work through that process and work through like a government process where you have progressive tax systems, it actually means sort of different people pay, and for different roles, I think it's appropriate that different people pay, and so I think defining the roles very clearly is very important.
Thanks very much. I'm now going to take us back to housing, because you only need to read the telly every day or turn on the news to know it's all about housing. I'm going to first go to Elizabeth because, councils, there's a lot of pressure on councils to increase housing stock. How do you see the DAP process helping councils manage the tension between approving more housing development and not building in high risk areas. So I'll go to you first, Elizabeth, and then to you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Look, certainly the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley is a particularly vulnerable area, and what we think the key is in all of this tension between risk and housing is actually that deep community engagement that says, as Phyllis said, we didn't put them there. People long before us established those communities on terribly flood-prone pieces of land. And what we think the key to that is having those deep conversations with that community around what is their tolerable risk, what is their appetite there. In particular, all of that social fabric that comes with supporting the existing housing. So it's not so much about establishing new housing necessarily in our most flood-prone areas, but really it's about how do we maintain social cohesion, how do we maintain social fabric, how do we keep our local economies still moving, and how do we enable these communities to be livable into the future, whilst still managing those highest risks. I think that would be the key for us, I think.
Thanks. To you, Steve.
Thanks, Amanda. And I think that question again speaks to complexity. There is no easy answer. I think recognising existing communities and the existing risk of those risk profiles faced by those communities, but also looking at what are society and communities' needs moving forward. Housing supply is just one part of that. Investment, we've heard investment in mitigation measures, infrastructure, resilience measures, etc., is definitely another part of it. From a planning perspective, we make decisions all the time, from strategic planning all the way down to site-specific development decisions. A big part of that process is an informed decision about what is occurring at place. The department's already leading a heap of strategic planning processes. Transport-oriented development is a good example, where we're considering what those risks are in a different framing from probably that was done 15, 20, 50, 30 years ago. For example, with the TOD program, flood is a critical input into deciding where the new housing would be. So if you look across the Hawkesbury Nepean, and we've got a heap of information about the risk profile associated with flooding. I mean, we all know Hawkesbury is a bathtub. We all know about that risk. Government's been working on this problem since at least 2011. There's been really good information. And so feeding that information into the planning decision process, so it's not a binary decision just about more house here, less house there, but it's a decision about, do we want more houses? What's the risk profile of those houses? What's the infrastructure that is needed to support those houses? What is the status of that community? What do they need to maintain? Amenity of that community? Where have they taken their hits in terms of previous disasters? All of that is really critical to being able to answer that question about how do you, as you said at the start, how do you deliver against those dual objectives of making sure we can meet that housing crisis, but in a way that doesn't put more people in a worse position that costs community and government more and more over time.
Thanks, and I think that's a really good point, because people have referenced the buyback program in the Northern Rivers, and we know the trauma that communities experience where they accept they need to be relocated from those very high-risk floodplains, but we don't want to create that risk anymore. We don't want to put our communities in that position of having to make those really, really difficult choices. I think, Ollie, you wanted to...
Yeah, I just want to say a couple of things, because Lismore's my hometown, and so this is the lived experience. We have an office in, and then I could have a big yarn about it. But the specific I just want to talk about is this reactionary kind of, we can't have people living there, and people, like Lismore's a meeting place. Old people will be camping there forever, but they mainly camp up on the hill. So there's this kind of understanding of, we actually are drawn, like first settlers came to that place, because of the way the two rivers meet there, the ships come in there, the old people, same sort of story. So the point is really about, I think we need to be talking more about like typology and the type of, like changing the way we build, and not just the housing, but community. because, like, it's really hard being in Lismore. Like, it's a city, a bit like Parramatta. Look at Parramatta now. I'm not saying we should do Lismore into Parramatta, but there are ways that we can better plan and engineer so people aren't at the interface of risk. They may be inconvenienced at times, when it floods, which it will inevitably do. But this sort of and there's places that people built, they're building in the river and they should move. So there is work that needs to be done. There's definitely places people shouldn't live. But there's definitely places that people could be living with different typology, different infrastructure, that would support a different type of community and would unlock, the potential, places like Lismore, it's a regional city. It's got all this infrastructure, we're dealing with bigger global challenges. I think that we really need to understand some different ways of planning and doing housing that will help us to, we can't just, anyway, I'll get carried away. But yeah, there's definitely work that needs to be done there. So we change this black and white, good and bad, can't live, because we rush off the floodplain into the hills where the fires are coming, so there is a place that's purely safe. It's just accept tolerable risk, understanding, how we have to change practice and reorientate ourselves in the landscape.
Thanks, Ollie. Now we've got a question here that's been waiting some time.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Gary Sanderfield. I'm with Fordham, Australia. We're a not-for-profit that is partially funded by NEMA. We do mental health and well-being, specifically around first responders, their family members, and then volunteers such as DRA, SES, and such. First of all, thank you to Mal and Amanda and team for putting this together. I think this is a huge step for the state's disaster preparedness response and recovery stage. Also, thank you because of a grant that from you guys, we just completed a study with Gallipoli Medical Research on the impact that our services have on risk reduction from mental health and well-being perspective. So I want to talk about in the DAP, it talks about vulnerability, but it falls a bit shy specifically of talking about mental health and well-being. And what are we going to do to map out the impact of that mental health and well-being? And is there going to be specific funding associated with development of resilience and recovery?
Who would like to respond to a mental health and wellbeing question?
I've had a lot to say, but I have a quick little go at it. But so in a lot of the work that we do, Juggle, and a lot of my work, it's actually wellbeing and healing work. And so, like that's part of that co-benefit thing. It's like people saying reduce risk. We're like, trying to get Aboriginal communities on country applying fire, which is very healing for them and country, yeah. And so Jagun, like at the same time we've been, trying to get good fire in and do river restoration and these kind of very practical things. We've also got a youth engagement program looking at youth at risk. We've also got research programs with the Rural Centre for Health and other looking at particularly Aboriginal wellbeing, but that's like everybody connecting to country, being able to learn, like fire trauma, flood trauma, being able to like use kind of like, how do we, people that are scared of fire and then they don't want fire in the landscape anymore because they've seen bad fire. So we get them out doing cultural burning and talking about good fire and, and being able to sort of help connect people in. And so I think, that's one of the biggest challenges we have in disaster adaptation is that people are coming from a trauma response generally, the lived experience. And so we need to be able to harness that trauma and turn it into good practice and being able to process that well-being. So we think these things are intrinsically linked, and that's what I was saying before about those efficiencies. Not only are we trying to solve a mental health problem, we're using that as a pathway for people to change the way that they, and not just the way that they do things in their backyard or the neighbourhood, and the things that they buy and the interests, in the community, because that's having an impact. Like what's driving a lot of the extreme events is climate change, and that's linked to how we consume and that's there's a feedback loop there. Like that's one of the most traumatizing things for me when I think about I was the first person into my parents-in-law's house in North Lismore, and we're pulling everything out. We spent days pulling everything out. Everyone's pulling everything out. There's hundreds and hundreds of tons of people's lives on the streets, and into dumps, and then the immune response is to go and get more stuff, and not really process the trauma of what we've lost, and then what do we really need, because the more that we consume, the more communities are going to be impacted by the extreme events. So something to think about.
And Phyllis?
Yeah, I've got to say the RA for us out in the Central West We've had a senior leaders group from day dot. I think we were maybe the first one that was set up, Mel, or the second one with Northern Rivers. We were both set up. I've found that the RA, in conjunction with Forbes Shire Council, we have been able to make sure that we have enough opportunities for people that are struggling mentally with their flood disaster recovery, that we, on a very, very often basis with the RA and on our own as a council, we make sure we have contact with those people. But I've got to say, one of the people, and I can't speak highly enough, is Sharon, the pod lady. I'm not going to say anymore, but she's brilliant. And her care and concern for all of those people. And you can imagine anyone that's had to live in a pod for the last 2 or 3 years, it's been pretty tough on them. She has been extraordinary in her care of those people and her relaying of whether they need extra help or not. So that, as a community, and I'm very connected to my community, so it doesn't take me long to know that someone's in bother and we can get help to them. So we seriously take mental health, not just in flood recovery, but totally across our shire, very, very seriously. And we've got a lot of forums that can help those people. We've got Talk to Me Bro that gives people, and it's women and men, they've got an opportunity every month to come together and be able to get rid of some of those concerns and worries that they've got. So I think as a council, we do have a responsibility as well.
I will just add to that as well, and trying to be, more on the front foot around mental health and well-being and vulnerability of communities. Our Dr. Dip will be the first hazard and risk data platform that will also bring in data across the 4 domains, so built, economic, social and natural. So we will be bringing in data sets around social vulnerability. We'll be drawing on the Australian Disaster Resilience Index 2 that has just been launched, that will bring in those coping and adaptive capacities around the capacity for resilience. So that data will be available to councils to say, where are your more vulnerable communities? Where do we need to be delivering preparedness campaigns? Where do we need to be supporting communities more around their disaster planning? So I think at a systems level, the data won't just be about, the physical or built environment, which is so often the case. It will be about the people. I do want to go to a question that we've been asked about community, because I think really this is ultimately all about communities. So, there's a questioner asking, how will we bring communities on this journey with us, which is really the critical part of this work. Communities experience risk in place and they build their resilience and their adaptive capacities in place. So I'm keen to hear from the panellists about how we bring community with us. Would you like to go first, Elizabeth, on that one?
Thank you. And as you highlighted in your earlier presentation, Amanda, the RA has done some wonderful work out in communities, talking to them about risk, educating them, and also in our instance, it's just about what does living and working on a floodplain really mean. We often get nervous somewhat about an underappreciation of the risks. We talk about our community being very good at a 14-metre flood, but my goodness, when an actual really big one comes, that we perhaps don't have that level of appreciation. So we've got a lot of work ahead of us, certainly with RA and the work that you've done building on that platform. I will say the benefit of the Hawkesbury City Council experience is that on the back of the Black Summer bushfires and then those repeated flood events, we have very good connections into our outlying and most vulnerable communities and building those relationships with the community and those community leaders to help them build their own resilience and help them help themselves has been critical for us as we start to tail off that level of support through things like community hubs and community recovery officers. Has been probably the biggest takeout for us in terms of our community resilience. We spoke a little bit about mental health. That is absolutely a critical concern for our community and in many areas. As I said, our most flood-prone communities are also some of those are our most bushfire-prone communities as well. And so we've got to do that deep engagement at a really personal one-on-one level, often out in those communities to help them help themselves is our narrative.
Thanks. And I think Ollie wants to answer that.
Yeah, I get making space for community, and like most of the stuff we do at Juggling is about community, not just the Aboriginal community. Like a lot of the work that we do is with the non-Aboriginal community, landholders and people that have been impacted are crying out for connection and help to solve things that, a lot of people don't trust the government, don't trust RA, so being able to work through partnerships, like that's kind of, Juggling, we're mob, we care for country, we're not the government, but we're at the interface of building relationships. So, in the same way, like I don't have at times a lot of trust for the government, but I trust the people that I know and the parts of policy and legislation that I know is working and people are committed to. So I have faith in that, but I still have concerns. But that across the community varies a lot. So making space, things like, the NIDA, the National Indigenous Disaster Resilience Gathering, my brother Bayami and us kind of hatched this plan to just get a heap of mob and people in the sector to come and be on country and, show them some fire and show them a community that's been impacted and show First Nations leadership. So building trust in those spaces. So, like Amanda's there and other people are there and people get to build connection. So yes, make space, build connection, and resource that community capacity, which is the other challenging thing. But like I said, there's so many challenges, but all these amazing opportunities that are coming through these relationships to better understand communities. And I guess I should also just say, some of the work we've been doing at Natural Hazards Research Australia, Andrew's here, looking at, the disaster index and resilience in communities and sort of how do we build those, foundations. We built these some research project looking at how do you build those foundations for research that understands what community needs. How do we, because so much of what, natural hazards being asked is what SES or RA or, Royal Fire Service. But what do the community need? How do we make sure that there's that relationship's being built and we're strengthening that into informing policy and investment and practice?
And I'll go to Penny.
So I think it's really good comments that you make. For us in the energy sector, the community engagement is also really important. One of the things that we're starting to experience is some of the communities that we're trying to engage are starting to become really quite fatigued. So lots of people are coming to them with the same questions, and for community members it's really hard to differentiate between, what's the distributor and what's the transmitter, and all of those types of questions. So I think it's actually an aspect where it's really important that we work together, and so that the community sees us as being sort of one entity that all trying to work with them. And I think a little bit of thought is needed to go into that, because one of the challenges that we have is the community engagement that we do needs to meet the requirements of our regulator, which has particular needs. So long as we can build some of that in along the way. And then later on, when we're working with communities, again, we sort of need to be able to define our role and play our role. And so, in some of our communities, the most vulnerable communities where socially the people are vulnerable, they're more likely to experience outage. We've been trying to set up the energy component of community resilience hubs. And that's, one of the roles that we would like to, be able to play where it's appropriate. So I think being able to work together in terms of how we work with communities is something that hopefully the DAPs will really enable.
Thanks, Penny. I think we have time for one more audience question. If anyone has a burning question to ask. No more hands are going up. Oh, there is one at the back there.
Hi, Simon Strauss from Arb Australia and Active Green Services. I've worked with Orange to set canopy targets and LGA safe canopy targets. We've worked on disaster response and recovery in a number of LGAs around Australia. Steve, your group have got a fantastic innovation around green infrastructure valuation, and we're trying to improve green infrastructure. One of the challenges, though, for example, in Victoria, was that Energy Safe Victoria rejected their own expert committee, which basically cost the community about $1 billion in canopy, where trees could have grown more into low bushfire or not non-bushfire areas. How do we balance all of these bits and pieces and make sure that we don't over-egg the risk decision when in fact there are huge benefits? And really the on-country bit reflects that, because there are benefits, not necessarily from disaster, but some of the risk factors around disaster certainly provide incredibly strong community benefits, and particularly in the wellbeing space. So it is complex. How do we do all of this stuff?
I think it's a great question you asked about canopy cover, where we're sitting here in Greater Western Sydney, and last year RA collaborated on the development of the city heat smart plan. And so, we know that canopy cover is critical for heat wave as well. So I will turn to my colleagues. How do we balance? I might start with you, Amanda, at the end. How do we balance competing? It really is that competing priorities between, cooling and bushfire risk, between housing and flood risk. So interested in your comments broadly around balancing competing priorities and agendas.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Look, I think the commentary from the panel today around tolerable risk is really critical in this space. And to do that, I think it circles back to we need good evidence and data around risk, but multifaceted risk. So across the domains, including the social dimensions, to be able to make good decisions around those trade-offs. And then I think really good pathways to bring the community along that journey and make sure they're community-informed discussions. Like from a NEMA perspective, community resilience sits at the heart of everything we do, but we recognise that we don't do that on the ground. So we may have LOs and others that work in that space, but we're clearly working through partners. So our relationship with New South Wales RA, with the Australian Local Government Association and their closeness to their communities, the information through these guidelines, that's what informs the decisions at the federal level. That's how we engage with communities, also recognising the fatigue factor there. So I think it needs to be a multifaceted approach. And then there are some difficult conversations that need to be had, some difficult decisions that need to be made. I think the other piece around evidence and data that's really important and touches on the Treasury conversation a little bit as well is that comes at the end of that investment. So what are the benefits that are being delivered by investment in risk reduction? Not just the costs that we've avoided through subsequent disasters, but the broader economic and social benefits, including around social capital and social cohesion. How can we tell that story? How can we tell that story in context and with numbers to really make that case about the choices we're making, but also the need for investment in the right places?
Thanks, Amanda. I think that's a great point you make around social cohesion. So the RA is developing a social cohesion measurement tool that we will use as part of our DAP planning as well. Phyllis, did you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think I've got your question right. Just from an Australian Local Government Association viewpoint, we did some research demonstrating that councils' investment in climate change adaptation measures are estimated to deliver $4.7 billion in the next 5 years. So as an organisations across Australia, we're very mindful about what you're saying with our disaster recovery, and also about having those climate change initiatives that will assist us with our disaster planning. So I think that's a really good start for local government across Australia, and I think that's getting bigger and better every year, and we'll continue to do that research so that we can keep tracking that it's on an upward balance, instead of going backwards. So local government on the whole is very, very mindful of not only disaster recovery and doing the right things, but also having climate change adaptation along the way.
Thanks very much, Steve.
Thanks, Amanda. It's almost the answer to the question is almost the discussion that we've had throughout this morning. One of the critical things, though, thanks, Simon, I think is that we're getting better at listening. We obviously need to get better, but I think we are. And I think the discussion around canopy for me is a really interesting insight into the ability to learn from your listening. So anyone who's worked on a large-scale development infrastructure project, whatever it might be, you'll know you've got your line items, you've got the things you've got to deliver, and probably somewhere at the end of that, it's going to be a line item about landscaping, or it'll be the last thing that gets delivered. It'll be a little bit of green at the end. It's an important part. We recognise that as an important part of building amenity, building climate resilience, a whole raft of benefits. But what often happened in the past is that line item, it's the last thing, the budget blows out, it gets pushed. That was the lived experience. And people would come along and go, hey, having some green infrastructure, having that urban amenity is really important. And it would almost be dismissed as this, 1970s style hippie argument, include the trees. We listened. The listening came from multiple perspectives. Community was suffering in some areas from low canopy because of the impact of heat. We know that in Western Sydney, we do a lot of work with the diabetes area of the Western Sydney Health Service. We know that people can't get out and be active, and that's a direct result of their urban form. We know that Treasury make decisions around what infrastructure that gets invested in. By listening to all those different perspectives, we're actually able to generate change in the way that green infrastructure is considered, costed, valued, and delivered across the planning spectrum. I think the DAP guidelines is actually a really good example of government listening to what are the things that community and government and industry are saying are needed in place to make that place less risky, more resilient, whatever it might be. And I think part of the DAP guidelines from a planning perspective, when the DAPs are done, will deliver is that information base, but in a way that means something to decision makers, means something to those who are, basically holding the purse strings, but also reflect community, industry, and government desires about what is that's needed. So look, I think that that snapshot about the massive work that we've done across Greater Sydney, and that's now been expanded out up and down the coast in terms of looking at canopy, working with partners, investing in urban greening, is just a snapshot of what I'm hopeful that will come out from the application of the DAP guidelines.
Thanks, Steve. Look, sadly, our conversation time has come to an end. I think you'll agree with me. It's been a really rich and insightful discussion, and our panellists have really contributed to it. So please join me in thanking them. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to share a few reflections. I think you can tell I'm pretty passionate about disaster risk reduction. I've been banging on about this for 30 years, long before anyone else was listening. There was a few of us, early adopters in fire services talking about community preparedness, and it's great to see it's now mainstreamed and everyone is thinking about it. So thank you all for contributing your expertise to what is somewhat a wicked problem, but I think we have a way forward working together and working collaboratively. We're extremely proud that we've been able to launch the DAP guidelines today, and I'd just like to thank all my team, all my colleagues for their hard work to get us to this point, and also to those who worked hard on this launch event. It's been a great event, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to our panellists and to Mel and to Minister Saffin as well. We have a long way to go. I would describe this as, crawl, walk, run. People are saying to me, oh, could we use DAPs to do X, Y, Z? I've said, look, we've got to, we're laying the foundations, we're doing that early work. But I also think success begets success. We will have the first foundation DAP to point to when, it's released by government, in the coming months. For those of you who think it's a bit of a sort of conceptual thing over there, you'll be able to read it. And I have to tell you, Emma Whale and the team, when I read it for the first time, I said, it's a great read. It is a really, really good piece of work, and I commend the HNV team for that work. We've got a lot of lessons that we've gathered along the way, and we'll be drawing on those lessons as we work with other JOs across the state to implement DAPs. And, hopefully we'll get better at it and we'll get a bit quicker at it over time. And we'll use those lessons and, set up a community of practice across all of those JOs so everyone can learn from each other and we will all rise together. That's the whole point of this. We're building capability and capacity into the system as we go forward. It is a team sport. You can see that up there on the slide now. Disaster adaptation planning and adaptation and mitigation is a team sport. We all need to come to the table together to work on these problems and what the solutions look forward as we go into the future. We know we are facing a difficult climate future for ourselves, our children, and in my case, our grandchildren. So we want to get this right. And I think New South Wales is taking those first early steps to systematically address the risk that our communities are going to experience and to make a difference for, future generations. And I'm really encouraged by the work that RA is able to lead with all of our partners here in the room to do just that. So what's next? We're going to continue to develop, implement DAPs for HNV, for the Northern Rivers, and for the JOs we're working with. We'll continue listening to you all and to sharing the lessons as we go forward. As the Minister mentioned, we've made good progress on the Hawkesbury and Nepean Valley DAP, and I think it's a powerful example of how we can work together to deliver a really meaningful piece of work. And we hope, Elizabeth, when you get to read it, you will agree with that. The DAPs do explore these complex options and trade-offs. There are no easy solutions here. I think everyone in the room acknowledges that, but it's only through cross-government, cross-agency, cross-council discussions that we will creatively develop and deliver those solutions together. So I encourage you to have a read of the guidelines. You all will be able to take a hard copy home. Not that you get many things in hard copy now, but it is sometimes nice to have that document in your hands. Please reach out to me or to any of the team if you have any questions after today. There will be some fact sheets up on our website. Shahana and the team have led all that, and some Q&As and the like if you're not sort of sure how to take this work forward. So thanks so much for joining us here today. I think we are bang on time, maybe a minute late. Sorry for those online. For those in the room, please stay and enjoy a morning tea with us and a bit of networking time. Thanks very much for this morning. Thank you to our CEO, Lanyon, for his leadership of this work, and to Minister Saffin, and good morning.